Hello, this is Joe Yuhan, back again to talk a little bit more about hip hinge, to clarify some things about hip hinge, to talk about how we can use hip hinge plus a propulsive technique to really solidify efficient running, and then ways to strengthen into hip hinging. And so we had a lot of great comments about the first hip hinging post and a lot of questions too. And so the first one was about this idea of running tall. And so we've heard a lot from coaches or other experts, and even I've talked and been guilty at times of overemphasizing running tall, and I want to clarify what that means. If we go back to the posture discussion, there's two components of posture, right? There is stacking of the body segments, and then there's angling. And very often running tall has to do with, we're referring to that angle. And so running tall, very often we think, well, we're supposed to be like this. Well, this represents over tall, where I am too extended, and in a hyperextended state, I'm overusing my low back muscles and underusing my core. And so in the context of hip hinging, we don't want to be overextended. Even in a hip hinge position, what's going to happen is that hyperactivity of my lumbar is going to eventually pull me out of it into what I call standing up in your stride. Conversely though, we don't want to be slumped down. That represents a flexion angle, and so slumping into a hip hinge is no good either. And so my interpretation of a neutral tall running is taking this neutral posture, which I consider to be tall, and then hinging into it here. And so maintaining that neutral is really important. And too many coaches, myself included, have been guilty of saying run tall because we see a lot of pretty good runners in this position. And my opinion is that you can't be a good runner and be slumped. You can be a pretty good runner and be overarched, but the very best runners in the world are going to be neutral in how they orient their spine in a hip hinge position. Because this position has the balance of using the hips but also activating the core, as opposed to being in a too tall state, which eventually is going to get you upright, pulling you back, and then you're more likely to overstride. The pretty good runners are those that tend to be injured a lot more than the very best. So keep that in mind. We want to be tall, but we still want to be neutral. Neutral still means a little bit of a back arch, just not too much. So that's the first bit. Then we heard a lot about this idea of pelvic tilting and how if you hinge a certain way, then that necessarily means that the pelvis is going to be tilted one way or another. And I disagree. It shouldn't have to be that way. And so again, we can use my belt line as a reference. In the efficient state, that belt line should be in neutral. If I am angled in a neutral position, this is where I should be. And so nothing should change with that angle as I go into my hinge. Doesn't mean that I'm anterior pelvic tilted or posterior tilted. We want to maintain neutral. Neutral alignment means automatic core engagement, automatic hip muscle engagement in this position. So more often than not, we have to just find this position, practice it, and strengthen into it, which we'll talk about in a little bit later. So one other really important comment or question was made about, okay, well, we're in this hip hinge position. Well, how do we propel in this position? What's the best way? And before I get into that, we're going to talk about one other thing that was mentioned as an issue of like, okay, well, if I'm in this position, there's this tendency to, okay, I'm into my hip. Well, what if I'm into my knee and into my ankle? And by no means am I saying that a hip hinge position means that we're running like this. Because this is the opposite of running too tall. I call this running deflated. And deflated, it refers to I am hyperflexed at my knee and at my ankle. And so what I like to think about is, yes, we want to have a hip hinge angle, but if we inflate to a point of just the slightest amount of knee flexion and ankle dorsiflexion, that's the position of efficiency. Because that tall leg puts a minimum amount of strain at the knee or at the ankle. And so how do we do that? How do we propel in this position? How do we maintain this position? And my answer to that combines hip hinging with a concept called Pawback. And I've written about Pawback, I've got a video about Pawback, and Pawback is this concept of pulling the leg from this position underneath the body. And so Pawback is this really powerful tool to decrease overstriding, improving landing efficiency, and improving hip utilization and hip extension. But what it also does, very interestingly, is when you come through, pawing and pulling through that nearly straight leg, it helps maintain that only slight, nearly straight knee angle, and same thing at the ankle. So if you're pawing back, it's really hard to deflate and to run like this when you're in a hip hinge and pawing back. And again, the very best runners in the world do those two things really well. And so that's my answer to that is, can you get into a hip hinge and combine that with that Pawback action to both enhance your landing, maintain this position, and then of course, enhance your push-off. And so the last thing we want to talk about is, okay, this is complicated, it's hard to balance. How can I be in this position, maintain this neutrality, not be overflexed at the knee and ankle? And the answer is we want to strengthen into that. So besides just running, there's a variety of options that we have to strengthen into this position. The first thing you can do is just run. The second thing that I really like to do is do treadmill uphill hiking. That involves getting on a treadmill 10 to 15 degrees and just work on being in this position. A lot of people in the gym, you'll see them completely out of their hip hinge, just holding on to the treadmill like this. But for us ultra runners, we need to practice being in this position and utilizing the hip. And so walking is a lot easier to practice that than running. The other things that you can do are things that we've talked about before in this column, things like the ice skater exercise. Anything you can do, single leg balance, ice skater deals with that, doing the running pattern. Anything in your hip hinge is going to be a great thing to do. I like to do bicep curls in the gym, slight knee flexion, either both legs forward or in a staggered position. Again, I'm adopting that posture, core and hips are working really hard to maintain it. You can do step-ups, stepping up and down. Same thing, adopting this position. Deadlift. Deadlift, you're going to go through the whole range of motion, but you're still working on maintaining neutral. Last but not least, you can do something like the runner heel raise, where again, you're in a running position and just working on the ankle. So there's lots of options, but the most important thing is just to approximate that position, practice that position, and find that balance between hip utilization and otherwise being tall. Good luck.